Laws by Plato, Book 7, translated by Benjamin Jowett.
And now, assuming children of both sexes to have been born, it will be proper for us to consider, in the next place, their nurture and education. This cannot be left altogether unnoticed, and yet may be thought a subject fitted rather for precept and admonition than for law. In private life there are many little things, not always apparent, arising out of the pleasures and pains and desires of individuals, which run counter to the intention of the legislator, and make the characters of the citizens various and dissimilar. This is an evil in states, for by reason of their smallness and frequent occurrence, there would be an unseemliness and want of propriety in making them penal by law. And if made penal, they are the destruction of the written law, because mankind get the habit of frequently transgressing the law in small matters. The result is that you cannot legislate about them, and still less can you be silent. I speak somewhat darkly, but I shall endeavor also to bring my wares into the light of day, for I acknowledge that at present there is a want of clearness in what I am saying.
Very true.
Am I not right in maintaining that a good education is that which tends most to the improvement of mind and body?
Undoubtedly.
And nothing can be plainer than that the fairest bodies are those which grow up from infancy in the best and straightest manner?
Certainly.
And do we not further observe that the first shoot of every living thing is by far the greatest and fullest? Many will even contend that a man at 25 does not reach twice the height which he attained at 5.
True.
Well, and is not rapid growth without proper and abundant exercise the source endless evils in the body?
Yes.
And the body should have the most exercise when it receives most nourishment.
But, stranger, are we to impose this great amount of exercise upon newly born infants?
Nay, rather on the bodies of infants still unborn.
What do you mean, my good sir, in the process of gestation?
Exactly. I am not at all surprised that you have never heard of this very peculiar sort of gymnastic applied to such little creatures, which, although strange, I will endeavor to explain to you.
By all means.
The practice is more easy for us to understand than for you, by reason of certain amusements which are carried to excess by us at Athens. Not only boys, but often older persons, are in the habit of keeping quails and cocks, which they train to fight one another. And they are far from thinking that the contests in which they stir them up to fight with one another are sufficient exercise, for, in addition to this, they carry them about tucked beneath their armpits, holding the smaller birds in their hands, the larger under their arms, and go for a walk of a great many miles for the sake of health, that is to say, not their own health, but the health of the birds, whereby they prove to any intelligent person that all bodies are benefited by shakings and movements, when they are moved without weariness, whether the motion proceeds from themselves, or is caused by a swing, or at sea, or on horseback, or by other bodies in whatever way moving, and that thus gaining the mastery over food and drink, they are able to impart beauty and health and strength. But admitting all this, what follows? Shall we make a ridiculous law that the pregnant woman shall walk about and fashion the embryo within, as we fashion wax before it hardens, and after birth swathe the infant for 2 years? Suppose that we compel nurses, under penalty of a legal fine, to be always carrying the children somewhere or other, either to the temples, or into the country, or to their relations' houses, until they are well able to stand, and to take care that their limbs are not distorted by leaning on them when they are too young. They should continue to carry them until the infant has completed its 3rd year. The nurses should be strong, and there should be more than one of them. Shall these be our rules, And shall we impose a penalty for the neglect of them? No, no. The penalty of which we were speaking will fall upon our own heads more than enough.
What penalty?
Ridicule, and the difficulty of getting the feminine and servant-like dispositions of the nurses to comply.
Then why was there any need to speak of the matter at all?
The reason is that masters and freemen in states, when they hear of it, are very likely to arrive at a true conviction that without due regulation of private life in cities, stability in the laying down of laws is hardly to be expected, and he who makes this reflection may himself adopt the laws just now mentioned, and, adopting them, may order his house and state well and be happy.
Likely enough.
And therefore let us proceed with our legislation, until we have determined the exercises which are suited to the souls of young children, in the same manner in which we have begun to go through the rules relating to their bodies.
By all means.
Let us assume, then, as a first principle in relation both to the body and soul of very young creatures, that nursing and moving about by day and night is good for them all, and that the younger they are, the more they will need it. Infants should live, if that were possible, as if they were always rocking at sea. This is the lesson which we may gather from the experience of nurses, and likewise from the use of the remedy of motion in the rites of the Corybantes. For when mothers want their restless children to go to sleep, they do not employ rest, but, on the contrary, motion, but they sing to them and lap them in sweet strains. And the Bacchic women are cured of their frenzy in the same manner by the use of the dance and of music.
Well, stranger, and what is the reason of this?
The reason is obvious.
What?
The affection both of the Bacchantes and of the children is an emotion of fear, which springs out of an evil habit of the soul. And when someone applies external agitation to affections of this sort, the motion coming from without gets the better of the terrible and violent internal one, and produces a peace and calm in the soul, and quiets the restless palpitation of the heart, which is a thing much to be desired, sending the children to sleep, and making the Bacchantes, although they remain awake, to dance to the pipe, with the help of the gods, to whom they offer acceptable sacrifices, and producing in them a sound mind, which takes the place of their frenzy. And, to express what I mean in a word, there is a good deal to be said in favor of this treatment.
Certainly.
But if fear has such a power, we ought to infer from these facts that every soul which from youth upward has been familiar with fears will be made more liable to fear, and every one will allow that this is the way to form a habit of cowardice, and not of courage.
No doubt.
And, on the other hand, the habit of overcoming, from our youth upwards, the fears and terrors which beset us, may be said to be an exercise of courage.
True.
And we may say that the use of exercise and motion in the earliest years of life greatly contributes to create a part of virtue in the soul.
Quite true.
Further, a cheerful temper, or the reverse, may be regarded as having much to do with high spirit on the one hand, or with cowardice on the other.
To be sure.
Then now we must endeavor to show how and to what extent we may, if we please, without difficulty implant either character in the young.
Certainly.
There is a common opinion that luxury makes the disposition of youth discontented and irascible, and vehemently excited by trifles. That, on the other hand, excessive and savage servitude makes men mean and abject, and haters of their kind, and therefore makes them undesirable associates.
But how must the state educate those who do not as yet understand the language of the country, and are therefore incapable of appreciating any sort of instruction?
I will tell you how. Every animal that is born is wont to utter some cry, and this is especially the case with man. and he is also affected with the inclination to weep more than any other animal.
Quite true.
Do not nurses, when they want to know what an infant desires, judge by these signs? When anything is brought to the infant and he is silent, then he is supposed to be pleased, but when he weeps and cries out, then he is not pleased. For tears and cries are the inauspicious signs by which children show what they love and hate. Now the time which is thus spent is no less than 3 years, and is a very considerable portion of life to be passed ill or well.
True.
Does not the discontented and ungracious nature appear to you to be full of lamentations and sorrows more than a good man ought to be?
Certainly.
Well, but if during these 3 years every possible care were taken that our nursling should have as little of sorrow and fear, and in general of pain as was possible, might we not expect in early childhood to make his soul more gentle and cheerful?
To be sure, stranger, more especially if we could procure him a variety of pleasures.
There I can no longer agree, Cleinias. You amaze me. To bring him up in such a way would be his utter ruin, for the beginning is always the most critical part of education. Let us see whether I am right.
Proceed.
The point about which you and I differ is of great importance, and I hope that you, Megillus, will help to decide between us. For I maintain that the true life should neither seek for pleasures, nor, on the other hand, entirely avoid pains, but should embrace the middle state, which I just spoke of as gentle and benign, and is a state which we by some divine presage and inspiration rightly ascribe to God. Now I say, he among men, too, who would be divine ought to pursue after this mean habit. He should not rush headlong into pleasures, for he will not be free from pains. Nor should we allow anyone, young or old, male or female, to be thus given any more than ourselves, and least of all the newly born infant, for in infancy more than at any other time the character is ingrained by habit. Nay, more, if I were not afraid of appearing to be ridiculous, I would say that a woman during her year of pregnancy should of all women be most carefully tended, and kept from violent or excessive pleasures and pains, and should at that time cultivate gentleness and benevolence and kindness.
You need not ask Megillus, stranger, which of us has most truly spoken, for I myself agree that all men ought to avoid the life of unmingled pain or pleasure, and pursue always a middle course. And having spoken well, may I add that you have been well answered?
Very good, Cleinias. And now let us all three consider a further point.
What is it?
That all the matters which we are now describing are commonly called by the general name of unwritten customs, and what are termed the laws of our ancestors are all of similar nature, and the reflection which lately arose in our minds, that we can neither call these things laws, nor yet leave them unmentioned, is justified, for they are the bonds of the whole state, and come in between the written laws which are or are hereafter to be laid down. They are just ancestral customs of great antiquity, which, if they are rightly ordered and made habitual, shield and preserve the previously existing written law. But if they depart from right and fall into disorder, then they are like the props of builders which slip away out of their place, and cause a universal ruin, and the fair superstructure falls, because the old foundations are undermined. Reflecting upon this, Cleinias, you ought to bind together the new state in every possible way, omitting nothing, whether great or small, of what are called laws or manners or pursuits, for by these means a city is bound together, and all these things are only lasting when they depend upon one another, and, therefore, we must not wonder if we find that many apparently trifling customs or usages come pouring in and lengthening out our laws.
Very true. We are disposed to agree with you.
Up to the age of 3 years, whether of boy or girl, if a person strictly carries out our previous regulations, and makes them a principal aim, he will do much for the advantage of the young creatures. But at 3, 4, 5, and even 6 years, the childish nature will require sports. Now is the time to get rid of self-will in him, punishing him, but not so as to disgrace him. We were saying about slaves, that we ought neither to add insult to punishment, so as to anger them, nor yet to leave them unpunished, lest they become self-willed. And a like rule is to be observed in the case of the freeborn. Children at that age have certain natural modes of amusement, which they find out for themselves when they meet. And all the children who are between the ages of 3 and 6 ought to meet at the temples of the villages, the several families of a village uniting on one spot. The nurses are to see that the children behave properly and orderly. They themselves and all their companies are to be under the control of 12 matrons, one for each company, who are annually selected to inspect them from the women previously mentioned, whom the guardians of the law appoint. These matrons shall be chosen by the women who have authority over marriage, one out of each tribe. All are to be of the same age, and let each of them, as soon as she is appointed, hold office and go to the temples every day, punishing all offenders, male or female, who are slaves or strangers, by the help of some of the public slaves. But if any citizen disputes the punishment, let her bring him before the wardens of the city, or, if there be no dispute, let her punish him herself. After the age of 6 years, the time has arrived for the separation of the sexes. Let boys live with boys, and girls in like manner with girls. Now they must begin to learn, the boys going to teachers of horsemanship, and the use of the bow, the javelin, and sling, and the girls, too, if they do not object, at any rate, until they know how to manage these weapons, and especially how to handle heavy arms. For I may note that the practice which now prevails is almost universally misunderstood.
In what respect?
In that the right and left hand are supposed to be by nature differently suited for our various uses of them, whereas no difference is found in the use of the feet and the lower limbs, but in the use of the hands we are, as it were, maimed by the folly of nurses and mothers. For although our several limbs are by nature balanced, we create a difference in them by bad habit. In some cases this is of no consequence, as, for example, when we hold the lyre in the left hand and the plectrum in the right, but it is downright folly to make the same distinction in other cases. The custom of the Scythians proves our error, for they not only hold the bow from them with the left hand and draw the arrow to them with their right, but use either hand for both purposes, and there are many similar examples in charioteering and other things, from which we may learn that those who make the left side weaker than the right act contrary to nature. In the case of the plectrum, which is of horn only, and similar instruments, as I was saying, it is of no consequence, but makes a great difference, and may be of very great importance to the warrior who has to use iron weapons, bows and javelins, and the like. Above all, when in heavy armor, he has to fight against heavy armor. And there is a very great difference between one who has learnt and one who has not, and between one who has been trained in gymnastic exercises and one who has not been. For as he who is perfectly skilled in the pancratium or boxing or wrestling is not unable to fight from his left side, and does not limp and draggle in confusion when his opponent makes him change his position, so in heavy armed fighting, and in all other things, if I am not mistaken, the like holds. He who has these double powers of attack and defense ought not in any case to leave them either unused or untrained, if he can help, and if a person had the nature of Geryon or Briareus, he ought to be able with his 100 hands to throw 100 darts. Now the magistrates, male and female, should see to all these things, the women superintending the nursing and amusements of the children, and the men superintending their education. that all of them, boys and girls alike, may be sound hand and foot, and may not, if they can help, spoil the gifts of nature by bad habits. Education has two branches, one of gymnastic, which is concerned with the body, and the other of music, which is designed for the improvement of the soul. And gymnastic has also two branches, dancing and wrestling, and one sort of dancing imitates musical recitation, and aims at preserving dignity and freedom, the other aims at producing health, agility, and beauty in the limbs and parts of the body, giving the proper flexion and extension to each of them, a harmonious motion being diffused everywhere, and forming a suitable accompaniment to the dance. As regards wrestling, the tricks which Antaeus and Cercyon devised in their systems out of a vain spirit of competition, or the tricks of boxing which Epeius or Amycus invented, are useless and unsuitable for war, and do not deserve to have much said about them. But the art of wrestling erect and keeping free the neck and hands and sides, working with energy and constancy, with a composed strength, for the sake of health, these are always useful, and are not to be neglected, but to be enjoined alike on masters and scholars. When we reach that part of legislation, and we will desire the one to give their instructions freely, and the others to receive them thankfully. Nor, again, must we omit suitable imitations of war in our choruses. Here in Crete you have the armed dances of the Cures, and the Lacedaemonians have those of the Dioscuri. And our Virgin Lady, delighting in the amusement of the dance, thought it not fit to amuse herself with empty hands. She must be clothed in a complete suit of armor, and in this attire go through the dance, and youths and maidens should in every respect imitate her, esteeming highly the favor of the goddess, both with a view to the necessities of war and to festive occasions. It will be right also for the boys, until such time as they go out to war, to make processions and supplications to all the gods in goodly array, armed and on horseback, in dances and marches, fast or slow, offering up prayers to the gods and to the sons of gods, and also engaging in contests and preludes of contests, if at all, with these objects. For these sorts of exercises and no others are useful both in peace and war, and are beneficial alike to states and to private houses. But other labors and sports and exercises of the body are unworthy of freemen, O Megillus and Cleinias. I have now completely described the kind of gymnastic which I said at first ought to be described. If you know of any better, will you communicate your thoughts?
It is not easy, stranger, to put aside these principles of gymnastic and wrestling, and to enunciate better ones.
Now we must say what has yet to be said about the gifts of the Muses and of Apollo. Before, we fancied that we had said all, and that gymnastic alone remained. But now we see clearly what points have been omitted, and should be first proclaimed. Of these, then, let us proceed to speak.
By all means.
Let me tell you once more, although you have heard me say the same before, that caution must be always exercised, both by the speaker and by the hearer, about anything that is very singular and unusual. For my tale is one which many a man would be afraid to tell, and yet I have a confidence which makes me go on.
What have you to say, stranger?
I say that in states generally no one has observed that the plays of childhood have a great deal to do with the permanence, or want of permanence, in legislation. For when plays are ordered with a view to children having the same plays, and amusing themselves after the same manner, and finding delight in the same playthings, the more solemn institutions of the state are allowed to remain undisturbed. Whereas if sports are disturbed, and innovations are made in them, and they constantly change, and the young never speak of their having the same likings, or the same established notions of good and bad taste, either in the bearing of their bodies or in their dress. But he who devises something new and out of the way in figures and colors, and the like is held in special honor, we may truly say that no greater evil can happen in a state, for he who changes the sports is secretly changing the manners of the young, and making the old to be dishonored among them, and the new to be honored. And I affirm that there is nothing which is a greater injury to all states than saying or thinking thus. Will you hear me tell how great I deem the evil to be?
You mean the evil of blaming antiquity and states?
Exactly.
If you are speaking of that, you will find in us hearers who are disposed to receive what you say not unfavorably, but most favorably.
I should expect so.
Proceed.
Well then, let us give all the greater heed to one another's words. The argument affirms that any change whatever except from evil is the most dangerous of all things. This is true in the case of the seasons and of the winds, in the management of our bodies and the habits of our minds, true of all things except, as I said before, of the bad. He who looks at the constitution of individuals accustomed to eat any sort of meat, or drink any drink, or to do any work which they can get, may see that they are at first disordered by them, but afterwards, as time goes on, their bodies grow adapted to them, and they learn to know and like variety and have good health and enjoyment of life. And if ever afterwards they are confined again to a superior diet, at first they are troubled with disorders, and with difficulty become habituated to their new food. A similar principle we may imagine to hold good about the minds of men, and the natures of their souls. For when they have been brought up in certain laws, which by some divine providence have remained unchanged during long ages, so that no one has any memory or tradition of their ever having been otherwise than they are, then every one is afraid and ashamed to change that which is established. The legislator must somehow find a way of implanting this reverence for antiquity, and I would propose the following way. People are apt to fancy, as I was saying before, that when the plays of children are altered, they are merely plays, not seeing that the most serious and detrimental consequences arise out of the change, and they readily comply with the child's wishes, instead of deterring him, not considering that these children who make innovations in their games, when they grow up to be men, will be different from the last generation of children, and, being different, will desire a different sort of life, and under the influence of this desire will want other institutions and laws. And no one of them reflects that there will follow what I just now called the greatest of evils to states. Changes in bodily fashions are no such serious evils, but frequent changes in the praise and censure of manners are the greatest of evils, and require the utmost prevision.
To be sure.
And now do we still hold to our former assertion that rhythms and music in general are imitations of good and evil characters in men? What say you?
That is the only doctrine which we can admit.
Must we not, then, try in every possible way to prevent our youth from even desiring to imitate new modes, either in dance or song? Nor must any one be allowed to offer them varieties of pleasures.
Most true.
Can any of us imagine a better mode of effecting this object than that of the Egyptians?
What is their method?
To consecrate every sort of dance or melody. First, we should ordain festivals, calculating for the year what they ought to be, and at what time, and in honor of what gods, sons of gods, and heroes, they ought to be celebrated, and, in the next place, what hymns ought to be sung at the several sacrifices, and with what dances the particular festival is to be honored. This has to be arranged at first by certain persons, and, when arranged, the whole assembly of the citizens are to offer sacrifices and libations to the Fates and all the other gods, and to consecrate the several odes to gods and heroes. And if anyone offers any other hymns or dances to any one of the gods, the priests and priestesses, acting in concert with the guardians of the law, shall, with the sanction of religion and the law, exclude him, and he who is excluded, if he do not submit, shall be liable all his life long to have a suit of impiety brought against him by anyone who likes.
Very good.
In the consideration of this subject, let us remember what is due to ourselves.
To what are you referring?
I mean that any young man, and much more any old one, when he sees or hears anything strange or unaccustomed, does not at once run to embrace the paradox, but he stands considering, like a person who is at a place where three paths meet and does not very well know his way. He may be alone, or he may be walking with others, and he will say to himself and them, "Which is the way?" and will not move forward until he is satisfied that he is going right. And this is what we must do in the present instance. A strange discussion on the subject of law has arisen, which requires the utmost consideration, and we should not at our age be too ready to speak about such great matters, or be confident that we can say anything certain all in a moment.
Most true.
Then we will allow time for reflection, and decide when we have given the subject sufficient consideration. But that we may not be hindered from completing the natural arrangement of our laws, let us proceed to the conclusion of them in due order, for very possibly, if God will, the exposition of them when completed may throw light on our present perplexity.
Excellent, stranger. Let us do as you propose.
Let us then affirm the paradox that strains of music are our laws, nomoi, and this latter being the name which the ancients gave to lyric songs, they probably would not have very much objected to our proposed application of the word. Someone, either asleep or awake, must have had a dreamy suspicion of their nature. And let our decree be as follows. No one in singing or dancing shall offend against public and consecrated models, and the general fashion among the youth, any more than he would offend against any other law. And he who observes this law shall be blameless. But he who is disobedient, as I was saying, shall be punished by the guardians of the laws, and by the priests and priestesses. Suppose that we imagine this to be our law.
Very good.
Can anyone who makes such laws escape ridicule? Let us see. I think that our only safety will be in first framing certain models for composers. One of these models shall be as follows. If when a sacrifice is going on, and the victims are being burnt according to law, if, I say, anyone who may be a son or brother, standing by another at the altar and over the victims, horribly blasphemes, will not his words inspire despondency and evil omens and forebodings in the mind of his father and of his other kinsmen?
Of course.
And this is just what takes place in almost all our cities. A magistrate offers a public sacrifice, and there come in not one, but many choruses, who take up a position a little way from the altar, and from time to time pour forth all sorts of horrible blasphemies on the sacred rites, exciting the souls of the audience with words and rhythms and melodies most sorrowful to hear. And he who at the moment when the city is offering sacrifice makes the citizens weep most, carries away the palm of victory. Now ought we not to forbid such strains as these? And if ever our citizens must hear such lamentations, then on some unblessed and inauspicious day let there be choruses of foreign and hired minstrels, like those hirelings who accompany the departed at funerals, with barbarous carrion chants. That is the sort of thing which will be appropriate if we have such strains at all, and let the apparel of the singers be, not circlets and ornaments of gold, but the reverse. Enough of all this. I will simply ask once more whether we shall lay down as one of our principles of song
What?
that we should avoid every word of evil omen. Let that kind of song which is of good omen be heard everywhere and always in our state. I need hardly ask again, but shall assume that you agree with me.
By all means. That law is approved by the suffrages of us all.
But what shall be our next musical law or type? Ought not prayers to be offered up to the gods when we sacrifice?
Certainly.
And our third law, if I am not mistaken, will be to the effect that our poets, understanding prayers to be requests which we make to the gods, will take especial heed that they do not, by mistake, ask for evil instead of good. To make such a prayer would surely be too ridiculous.
Very true.
Were we not a little while ago quite convinced that no silver or golden Plutus should dwell in our state?
To be sure.
And what has it been the object of our argument to show? Did we not imply that the poets are not always quite capable of knowing what is good or evil? And if one of them utters a mistaken prayer in song or words, he will make our citizens pray for the opposite of what is good in matters of the highest import. Than which, as I was saying, there can be few greater mistakes. Shall we then propose as one of our laws and models relating to the Muses?
What? Will you explain the law more precisely?
Shall we make a law that the poet shall compose nothing contrary to the ideas of the lawful, or just, or beautiful, or good, which are allowed in the state? Nor shall he be permitted to communicate his compositions to any private individuals, until he shall have shown them to the appointed judges and the guardians of the law, and they are satisfied with them. As to the persons whom we appoint to be our legislators about music, and as to the director of education, these have been already indicated. Once more, then, as I have asked more than once, shall this be our third law, and type and model? What do you say?
Let it be so, by all means.
Then it will be proper to have hymns and praises of the gods, intermingled with prayers, and after the gods' prayers and praises should be offered in like manner to demigods and heroes, suitable to their several characters.
Certainly.
In the next place, there will be no objection to a law, that citizens who are departed and have done good and energetic deeds, either with their souls or with their bodies, and have been obedient to the laws, should receive eulogies. This will be very fitting.
Quite true.
But to honor with hymns and panegyrics those who are still alive is not safe. A man should run his course, and make a fair ending, and then we will praise him, and let praise be given equally to women as well as men who have been distinguished in virtue. The order of songs and dances shall be as follows. There are many ancient musical compositions and dances which are excellent, and from these the newly founded city may freely select what is proper and suitable, and they shall choose judges of not less than 50 years of age, who shall make the selection, and any of the old poems which they deem sufficient they shall include. Any that are deficient or altogether unsuitable they shall either utterly throw aside or examine and amend, taking into their counsel poets and musicians, and making use of their poetical genius, but explaining to them the wishes of the legislator, in order that they may regulate dancing, music, and all choral strains according to the mind of the judges, and not allowing them to indulge, except in some few matters, their individual pleasures and fancies. Now the irregular strain of music is always made 10,000 times better by attaining to law and order, and rejecting the honeyed muse. Not, however, that we mean wholly to exclude pleasure, which is the characteristic of all music. And if a man be brought up from childhood to the age of discretion and maturity in the use of the orderly and severe music, when he hears the opposite he detests it, and calls it illiberal. But if trained in the sweet and vulgar music, he deems the severer kind cold and displeasing. So that, as I was saying before, while he who hears them gains no more pleasure from the one than from the other, the one has the advantage of making those who are trained in it better men, whereas the other makes them worse.
Very true.
Again, we must distinguish and determine on some general principle what songs are suitable to women, and what to men, and must assign to them their proper melodies and rhythms. It is shocking for a whole harmony to be inharmonical, or for a rhythm to be unrhythmical, and this will happen when the melody is inappropriate to them, and therefore the legislator must assign to these also their forms. Now, both sexes have melodies and rhythms which of necessity belong to them, and those of women are clearly enough indicated by their natural difference. The grand and that which tends to courage may be fairly called manly, but that which inclines to moderation and temperance may be declared both in law and in ordinary speech to be the more womanly quality. This, then, will be the general order of them. Let us now speak of the manner of teaching and imparting them, and the persons to whom, and the time when, they are severally to be imparted. As the shipwright first lays down the lines of the keel, and thus, as it were, draws the ship in outline, so do I seek to distinguish the patterns of life, and lay down their keels according to the nature of different men's souls, seeking truly to consider by what means, and in what ways, we may go through the voyage of life best. Now human affairs are hardly worth considering in earnest, and yet we must be in earnest about them. A sad necessity constrains us, and having got thus far, there will be a fitness in our completing the matter, if we can only find some suitable method of doing so. But what do I mean? Someone may ask this very question, and quite rightly too.
Certainly.
I say that about serious matters a man should be serious, and about a matter which is not serious he should not be serious, and that God is the natural and worthy object of our most serious and blessed endeavors, for man, as I said before, is made to be the plaything of God, and this, truly considered, is the best of him. Wherefore also every man and woman should walk seriously, and pass life in the noblest of pastimes, and be of another mind from what they are at present.
In what respect?
At present they think that their serious pursuits should be for the sake of their sports, for they deem war a serious pursuit, which must be managed well for the sake of peace. But the truth is, that there neither is, nor has been, nor ever will be, either amusement or instruction in any degree worth speaking of in war, which is nevertheless deemed by us to be the most serious of our pursuit. And therefore, as we say, every one of us should live the life of peace as long and as well as he can. And what is the right way of living? Are we to live in sports always? If so, in what kind of sports? We ought to live sacrificing and singing and dancing, and then a man will be able to propitiate the gods, and to defend himself against his enemies, and conquer them in battle. The type of song or dance by which he will propitiate them has been described, and the paths along which he is to proceed have been cut for him. He will go forward in the spirit of the poet. Telemachus, some things thou wilt thyself find in thy heart, but other things God will suggest. For I deem that thou wast not born or brought up without the will of the gods. And this ought to be the view of our alumni. They ought to think that what has been said is enough for them, and that any other things their genius and God will suggest to them, he will tell them to whom, and when, and to what gods severally they are to sacrifice and perform dances, and how they may propitiate the deities, and live according to the appointment of nature, being for the most part puppets, but having some little share of reality.
You have a low opinion of mankind, stranger.
Nay, Megillus, be not amazed, but forgive me. I was comparing them with the gods, and under that feeling I spoke. Let us grant, if you wish, that the human race is not to be despised, but is worthy of some consideration. Next follow the buildings for gymnasia and schools open to all. These are to be in 3 places in the midst of the city, and outside the city, and in the surrounding country. Also in 3 places there shall be schools for horse exercise, and large grounds arranged with a view to archery and the throwing of missiles, at which young men may learn and practice. Of these mention has already been made, and if the mention be not sufficiently explicit, let us speak further of them, and embody them in laws. In these several schools let there be dwellings for teachers, who shall be brought from foreign parts by pay, and let them teach those who attend the schools the art of war and the art of music, and the children shall come not only if their parents please, but if they do not please. There shall be compulsory education, as the saying is, of all and sundry, as far as this is possible, and the pupils shall be regarded as belonging to the state rather than to their parents. My law would apply to females as well as males. They shall both go through the same exercises. I assert, without fear of contradiction, that gymnastic and horsemanship are as suitable to women as to men. Of the truth of this I am persuaded from ancient tradition, and at the present day there are said to be countless myriads of women in the neighborhood of the Black Sea, called Sauromatades, who not only ride on horseback like men, but have enjoined upon them the use of bows and other weapons equally with the men. And I further affirm that if these things are possible, nothing can be more absurd than the practice which prevails in our own country, of men and women not following the same pursuits with all their strength and with one mind, for thus the state, instead of being a whole, is reduced to a half, but has the same imposts to pay and the same toils to undergo. And what can be a greater mistake for any legislator to make than this?
Very true. Yet much of what has been asserted by us, stranger, is contrary to the custom of states. Still, in saying that the discourse should be allowed to proceed, and that when the discussion is completed we should choose what seems best, you spoke very properly, and I now feel compunction for what I have said. Tell me, then, what you would next wish to say.
I should wish to say, Cleinias, as I said before, that if the possibility of these things were not sufficiently proven in fact, then there might be an objection to the argument. But the fact being as I have said, he who rejects the law must find some other ground of objection, and failing this, our exhortation will still hold good, nor will anyone deny that women ought to share as far as possible in education, and in other ways with men. For consider, if women do not share in their whole life with men, then they must have some other order of life.
Certainly.
And what arrangement of life to be found anywhere is preferable to this community which we are now assigning to them? Shall we prefer that which is adopted by the Thracians and many other races, who use their women to till the ground and to be shepherds of their herds and flocks, and to minister to them like slaves? Or shall we do as we and people in our part of the world do, getting together, as the phrase is, all our goods and chattels into one dwelling? We entrust them to our women, who are the stewards of them, and who also preside over the shuttles and the whole art of spinning. Or shall we take a middle course, as in Lacedaemon Megillus, letting the girls share in gymnastic and music, while the grown-up women, no longer employed in spinning wool, are hard at work weaving the web of life, which will be no cheap or mean employment, and in the duty of serving and taking care of the household, and bringing up the children, in which they will observe a sort of mean, not participating in the toils of war. And if there were any necessity that they should fight for their city and families, unlike the Amazons, they would be unable to take part in archery or any other skilled use of missiles, nor could they, after the example of the goddess, carry shield or spear, or stand up nobly for their country when it was being destroyed, and strike terror into their enemies, if only because they were seen in regular order. Living as they do, they would never dare at all to imitate the Sauromatades, who, when compared with ordinary women, would appear to be like men. Let him who will praise your legislators, but I must say what I think. The legislator ought to be whole and perfect, and not half a man only. He ought not to let the female sex live softly, and waste money, and have no order of life, while he takes the utmost care of the male sex, and leaves half of life only blessed with happiness, when he might have made the whole state happy.
What shall we do, Cleinias? Shall we allow a stranger to run down Sparta in this fashion?
Yes, for as we have given him liberty of speech, we must let him go on until we have perfected the work of legislation.
Very true.
Then now I may proceed?
By all means.
What will be the manner of life among men who may be supposed to have their food and clothing provided for them in moderation, and who have entrusted the practice of the arts to others, and whose husbandry committed to slaves paying a part of the produce brings them a return sufficient for men living temperately, who, moreover, have common tables in which the men are placed apart, and near them are the common tables of their families, of their daughters and mothers, which day by day the officers, male and female, are to inspect. They shall see to the behavior of the company, and so dismiss them. After which the presiding magistrate and his attendants shall honor with libations those gods to whom that day and night are dedicated, and then go home. To men whose lives are thus ordered, is there no work remaining to be done which is necessary and fitting, but shall each one of them live fattening like a beast? Such a life is neither just nor honorable, nor can he who lives it fail of meeting his due. And the due reward of the idle-fatted beast is that he should be torn in pieces by some other valiant beast, whose fatness is worn down by brave deeds and toil. These regulations, if we duly consider them, will never be exactly carried into execution under present circumstances, nor as long as women and children and houses and all other things are the private property of individuals. But if we can attain the second best form of polity, we shall be very well off. And to men living under this second polity, there remains a work to be accomplished, which is far from being small or insignificant, but is the greatest of all works, and ordained by the appointment of righteous law. For the life which may be truly said to be concerned with the virtue of body and soul is twice, or more than twice, as full of toil and trouble as the pursuit after Pythian and Olympic victories, which debars a man from every employment of life. For there ought to be no work interfering with the greater work of providing the necessary exercise and nourishment for the body, and instruction and education for the soul. Night and day are not long enough for the accomplishment of their perfection and consummation, and therefore to this end all freemen ought to arrange the way in which they will spend their time during the whole course of the day, from morning till evening, and from evening till the morning of the next sunrise. There may seem to be some impropriety in the legislator determining minutely the numberless details of the management of the house, including such particulars as the duty of wakefulness in those who are to be perpetual watchmen of the whole city. For that any citizen should continue during the whole of any night in sleep, instead of being seen by all his servants, always the first to awake and get up. This, whether the regulation is to be called a law or only a practice, should be deemed base and unworthy of a freeman. Also that the mistress of the house should be awakened by her handmaidens instead of herself first awakening them, is what the slaves, male and female, and the serving boys, and, if that were possible, everybody and everything in the house should regard as base. If they rise early, they may all of them do much of their public and of their household business, as magistrates in the city, and masters and mistresses in their private houses, before the sun is up. Much sleep is not required by nature, either for our souls or bodies, or for the actions which they perform. For no one who is asleep is good for anything, any more than if he were dead. But he of us who has the most regard for life and reason keeps awake as long as he can, reserving only so much time for sleep as is expedient for health, and much sleep is not required, if the habit of moderation be once rightly formed. Magistrates in states who keep awake at night are terrible to the bad, whether enemies or citizens, and are honored and reverenced by the just and temperate, and are useful to themselves and to the whole state. A night which is passed in such a manner, in addition to all the above-mentioned advantages, infuses a sort of courage into the minds of the citizens. When the day breaks, the time has arrived for youth to go to their schoolmasters. Now neither sheep nor any other animals can live without a shepherd, nor can children be left without tutors, or slaves without masters. And of all animals, the boy is the most unmanageable, inasmuch as he has the fountain of reason in him not yet regulated. He is the most insidious, sharp-witted, and insubordinate of animals. Wherefore he must be bound with many bridles. In the first place, when he gets away from mothers and nurses, he must be under the management of tutors on account of his childishness and foolishness. Then, again, being a freeman, he must be controlled by teachers, no matter what they teach, and by studies. But he is also a slave, and in that regard any freeman who comes in his way may punish him and his tutor and his instructor, if any of them does anything wrong. And he who comes across him, and does not inflict upon him the punishment which he deserves, shall incur the greatest disgrace, and let the guardian of the law, who is the director of education, see to him who, coming in the way of the offenses which we have mentioned, does not chastise them when he ought, or chastises them in a way which he ought not. Let him keep a sharp lookout, and take especial care of the training of our children, directing their natures, and always turning them to good according to the law. But how can our law sufficiently train the director of education himself? For as yet all has been imperfect, and nothing has been said either clear or satisfactory. Now, as far as possible, the law ought to leave nothing to him, but to explain everything, that he may be an interpreter and tutor to others. About dances and music and choral strains, I have already spoken both as to the character of the selection of them, and the manner in which they are to be amended and consecrated. But we have not as yet spoken, O illustrious guardian of education, of the manner in which your pupils are to use those strains which are written in prose, although you have been informed what martial strains they are to learn and practice, what relates in the first place to the learning of letters, and secondly to the lyre, and also to calculation, which, as we were saying, is needful for them all to learn, and any other things which are required with a view to war, and the management of house and city, and, looking to the same object, what is useful in the revolutions of the heavenly bodies, the stars and sun and moon, and the various regulations about these matters which are necessary for the whole state. I am speaking of the arrangements of days in periods of months, and of months in years, which are to be observed in order that seasons and sacrifices and festivals may have their regular and natural order, and keep the city alive and awake, the gods receiving the honors due to them, and men having a better understanding about them. All these things, O my friend, have not yet been sufficiently declared to you by the legislator. Attend, then, to what I am now going to say. We were telling you, in the first place, that you were not sufficiently informed about letters, and the objection was to this effect, that you were never told whether he who was meant to be a respectable citizen should apply himself in detail to that sort of learning, or not apply himself at all. And the same remark holds good of the study of the lyre. But now we say that he ought to attend to them. A fair time for a boy of 10 years old to spend in letters is 3 years. The age of 13 is the proper time for him to begin to handle the lyre, and he may continue at this for another 3 years, neither more nor less. And whether his father or himself like or dislike the study, he is not to be allowed to spend more or less time in learning music than the law allows. And let him who disobeys the law be deprived of those youthful honors of which we shall hereafter speak. Hear, however, first of all, what the young ought to learn in the early years of life, and what their instructors ought to teach them. They ought to be occupied with their letters until they are able to read and write, but the acquisition of perfect beauty or quickness in writing, if nature has not stimulated them to acquire these accomplishments in the given number of years, they should let alone. And as to the learning of compositions committed to writing which are not set to the lyre, whether metrical or without rhythmical divisions, compositions in prose, as they are termed, having no rhythm or harmony, seeing how dangerous are the writings handed down to us by many writers of this class, what will you do with them, O most excellent guardians of the law? Or how can the lawgiver rightly direct you about them? I believe that he will be in great difficulty.
What troubles you, stranger? And why are you so perplexed in your mind?
You naturally ask, Cleinias, and to you and Megillus, who are my partners in the work of legislation, I must state the more difficult, as well as the easier parts of the task.
To what do you refer in this instance?
I will tell you. There is a difficulty in opposing many myriads of mouths.
Well, and have we not already opposed the popular voice in many important enactments?
That is quite true, and you mean to imply that the road which we are taking may be disagreeable to some, but is agreeable to as many others, or if not to as many, at any rate to persons not inferior to the others, and in company with them you bid me, at whatever risk, to proceed along the path of legislation which has opened out of our present discourse, and to be of good cheer, and not to faint.
Certainly.
And I do not faint. I say, indeed, that we have a great many poets writing in hexameter, trimeter, and all sorts of measures, some who are serious, others who aim only at raising a laugh, and all mankind declare that the youth who are rightly educated should be brought up in them and saturated with them. Some insist that they should be constantly hearing them read aloud, and always learning them, so as to get by heart entire poets, while others select choice passages and long speeches, and make compendiums of them, saying that these ought to be committed to memory, if a man is to be made good and wise by experience and learning of many things. And you want me now to tell them plainly in what they are right and in what they are wrong.
Yes, I do.
But how can I in one word rightly comprehend all of them? I am of opinion, and if I am not mistaken, there is a general agreement that every one of these poets has said many things well, and many things the reverse of well. And if this be true, then I do affirm that much learning is dangerous to youth.
How would you advise the guardian of the law to act?
In what respect?
I mean, to what pattern should he look as his guide in permitting the young to learn some things and forbidding them to learn others? Do not shrink from answering.
My good Cleinias, I rather think that I am fortunate.
How so?
I think that I am not wholly in want of a pattern, for when I consider the words which we have spoken from early dawn until now, and which, as I believe, have been inspired by heaven, they appear to me to be quite like a poem. When I reflected upon all these words of ours, I naturally felt pleasure, for of all the discourses which I have ever learnt or heard, either in poetry or prose, this seemed to me to be the justest and most suitable for young men to hear. I cannot imagine any better pattern than this which the guardian of the law, who is also the director of education, can have. He cannot do better than advise the teachers to teach the young these words, and any which are of a like nature, if he should happen to find them, either in poetry or prose, or if he come across unwritten discourses akin to ours, he should certainly preserve them, and commit them to writing. And, first of all, he shall constrain the teachers themselves to learn and approve them, and any of them who will not, shall not be employed by him, but those whom he finds agreeing in his judgment, he shall make use of, and shall commit to them the instruction and education of youth. And here and on this wise let my fanciful tale about letters and teachers of letters come to an end.
I do not think, stranger, that we have wandered out of the proposed limits of the argument, but whether we are right or not in our whole conception, I cannot be very certain.
The truth, Cleinias, may be expected to become clearer when, as we have often said, we arrive at the end of the whole discussion about laws.
Yes.
And now that we have done with the teacher of letters, the teacher of the lyre has to receive orders from us.
Certainly.
I think that we have only to recollect our previous discussions, and we shall be able to give suitable regulations touching all this part of instruction and education to the teachers of the lyre.
To what do you refer?
We were saying, if I remember rightly, that the 60-years-old choristers of Dionysus were to be specially quick in their perceptions of rhythm and musical composition, that they might be able to distinguish good and bad imitation, that is to say, the imitation of the good or bad soul when under the influence of passion, rejecting the one and displaying the other in hymns and songs, charming the souls of youth, and inviting them to follow and attain virtue by the way of imitation.
Very true.
And with this view the teacher and the learner ought to use the sounds of the lyre, because its notes are pure, the player who teaches and his pupil rendering note for note in unison, but complexity and variation of notes, when the strings give one sound and the poet or composer of the melody gives another, also when they make concords and harmonies in which lesser and greater intervals, slow and quick, or high and low notes, are combined, or again, when they make complex variations of rhythms, which they adapt to the notes of the lyre. All that sort of thing is not suited to those who have to acquire speedy and useful knowledge of music in 3 years, for opposite principles are confusing, and create a difficulty in learning, and our young men should learn quickly, and their mere necessary acquirements are not few or trifling, as will be shown in due course. Let the director of education attend to the principles concerning music which we are laying down. As to the songs and words themselves, which the masters of choruses are to teach, and the character of them, they have been already described by us, and are the same which, when consecrated and adapted to the different festivals, we said were to benefit cities by affording them an innocent amusement.
That, again, is true.
Then let him who has been elected a director of music receive these rules from us as containing the very truth, and may he prosper in his office. Let us now proceed to lay down other rules in addition to the preceding about dancing and gymnastic exercise in general. Having said what remained to be said about the teaching of music, let us speak in like manner about gymnastic. For boys and girls ought to learn to dance and practice gymnastic exercises, ought they not?
Yes.
Then the boys ought to have dancing masters, and the girls dancing mistresses to exercise them.
Very good.
Then once more let us summon him who has the chief concern in the business, the superintendent of youth. He will have plenty to do, if he is to have the charge of music and gymnastic.
But how will an old man be able to attend to such great charges?
Oh, my friend, there will be no difficulty, for the law has already given, and will give him permission to select as his assistants in this charge any citizens, male or female, whom he desires, and he will know whom he ought to choose, and will be anxious not to make a mistake, from a due sense of responsibility, and from a consciousness of the importance of his office, and also because he will consider that if young men have been and are well brought up, then all things go swimmingly. But if not, it is not meet to say, nor do we say what will follow, lest the regarders of omens should take alarm about our infant state. Many things have been said by us about dancing and about gymnastic movements in general, for we include under gymnastics all military exercises, such as archery, and all hurling of weapons, and the use of the light shield, and all fighting with heavy arms, and military evolutions, and movements of armies, and encampings, and all that relates to horsemanship. Of all these things there ought to be public teachers, receiving pay from the state, and their pupils should be the men and boys in the state, and also the girls and women, who are to know all these things. While they are yet girls, they should have practiced dancing in arms, and the whole art of fighting. When grown-up women, they should apply themselves to evolutions and tactics, and the mode of grounding and taking up arms, if for no other reason, yet in case the whole military force should have to leave the city and carry on operations of war outside, that those who will have to guard the young and the rest of the city may be equal to the task. And, on the other hand, when enemies, whether barbarian or Hellenic, come from without with mighty force, and make a violent assault upon them, and thus compel them to fight for the possession of the city, which is far from being an impossibility, great would be the disgrace to the state if the women had been so miserably trained that they could not fight for their young, as birds will, against any creature, however strong, and die or undergo any danger, but must instantly rush to the temples, and crowd at the altars and shrines, and bring upon human nature the reproach that of all animals man is the most cowardly.
Such a want of education, stranger, is certainly an unseemly thing to happen in a state, as well as a great misfortune.
Suppose that we carry our law to the extent of saying that women ought not to neglect military matters, but that all citizens, male and female alike, shall attend to them.
I quite agree.
Of wrestling we have spoken in part, but of what I should call the most important part we have not spoken, and cannot easily speak without showing at the same time by gesture, as well as in word, what we mean. When word and action combine, and not till then, we shall explain clearly what has been said, pointing out that of all movements wrestling is most akin to the military art, and is to be pursued for the sake of this, and not this for the sake of wrestling.
Excellent.
Enough of wrestling. We will now proceed to speak of other movements of the body. Such motion may be in general called dancing, and is of two kinds. One of nobler figures, imitating the honorable, the other of the more ignoble figures, imitating the mean, and of both these there are two further subdivisions. Of the serious, one kind is of those engaged in war and vehement action, and is the exercise of a noble person and a manly heart. The other exhibits a temperate soul in the enjoyment of prosperity and modest pleasures, and may be truly called, and is the dance of peace. The warrior dance is different from the peaceful one, and may be rightly termed Pyrrhic. This imitates the modes of avoiding blows and missiles by dropping or giving way, or springing aside, or rising up or falling down, also the opposite postures which are those of action, as, for example, the imitation of archery, and the hurling of javelins, and of all sorts of blows. And when the imitation is of brave bodies and souls, and the action is direct and muscular, giving for the most part a straight movement to the limbs of the body, that, I say, is the true sort, but the opposite is not right. In the dance of peace, what we have to consider is whether a man bears himself naturally and gracefully, and after the manner of men who duly conform to the law. But before proceeding I must distinguish the dancing about which there is any doubt from that about which there is no doubt. Which is the doubtful kind, and how are the two to be distinguished? There are dances of the Bacchic sort, both those in which, as they say, they imitate drunken men, and which are named after the nymphs, and Pan, and Silenuses, and Satyrs, and also those in which purifications are made or mysteries celebrated. All this sort of dancing cannot be rightly defined as having either a peaceful or a warlike character, or indeed as having any meaning whatever, and may, I think, be most truly described as distinct from the warlike dance, and distinct from the peaceful, and not suited for a city at all. There let it lie, And so leaving it to lie, we will proceed to the dances of war and peace, for with these we are undoubtedly concerned. Now the unwarlike muse, which honors in dance the gods and the sons of the gods, is entirely associated with the consciousness of prosperity. This class may be subdivided into two lesser classes, of which one is expressive of an escape from some labor or danger into good, and has greater pleasures, the other expressive of preservation and increase of former good, in which the pleasure is less exciting. In all these cases, every man, when the pleasure is greater, moves his body more, and less, when the pleasure is less, and again, if he be more orderly and has learned courage from discipline, he moves less. But if he be a coward, and has no training or self-control, he makes greater and more violent movements, and in general, when he is speaking or singing, he is not altogether able to keep his body still. And so out of the imitation of words and gestures, the whole art of dancing has arisen. And in these various kinds of imitation, one man moves in an orderly, another in a disorderly manner, and as the ancients may be observed to have given many names, which are according to nature, and deserving of praise, so there is an excellent one which they have given to the dances of men who in their times of prosperity are moderate in their pleasures. The giver of names, whoever he was, assigned to them a very true and poetical and rational name, when he called them Emeleae, or dances of order, thus establishing two kinds of dances of the nobler sort, the dance of war which he called the Pyrrhic, and the dance of peace which he called Emeleia, or the dance of order, giving to each their appropriate and becoming name. These things the legislator should indicate in general outline, and the guardian of the law should inquire into them and search them out, combining dancing with music, and assigning to the several sacrificial feasts that which is suitable to them, and when he has consecrated all of them in due order, he shall for the future change nothing, whether of dance or song. Thenceforward the city and the citizens shall continue to have the same pleasures, themselves being as far as possible alike, and shall live well and happily. I have described the dances which are appropriate to noble bodies and generous souls, but it is necessary also to consider and know uncomely persons and thoughts, and those which are intended to produce laughter in comedy, and have a comic character in respect of style, song, and dance, and of the imitations which these afford. For serious things cannot be understood without laughable things, nor opposites at all without opposites, if a man is really to have intelligence of either. But he cannot carry out both in action, if he is to have any degree of virtue, and for this very reason he should learn them both, in order that he may not in ignorance do or say anything which is ridiculous and out of place. He should command slaves and hired strangers to imitate such things, but he should never take any serious interest in them himself, nor should any free man or free woman be discovered taking pains to learn them, and there should always be some element of novelty in the imitation. Let these then be laid down, both in law and in our discourse, as the regulations of laughable amusements which are generally called comedy. And if any of the serious poets, as they are termed, who write tragedy, come to us and say, O strangers, may we go to your city and country, or may we not? And shall we bring with us our poetry? What is your will about these matters? How shall we answer the divine men? I think that our answer should be as follows. Best of strangers, we will say to them, we also, according to our ability, are tragic poets, and our tragedy is the best and noblest, for our whole state is an imitation of the best and noblest life, which we affirm to be indeed the very truth of tragedy. You are poets, and we are poets, both makers of the same strains, rivals and antagonists, in the noblest of dramas, which true law can alone perfect, as our hope is. Do not then suppose that we shall all in a moment allow you to erect your stage in the agora, or introduce the fair voices of your actors, speaking above our own, and permit you to harangue our women and children, and the common people, about our institutions, in language other than our own, and very often the opposite of our own. For a state would be mad which gave you this license, until the magistrates had determined whether your poetry might be recited, and was fit for publication or not. Wherefore, O ye sons and scions of the softer muses, first of all show your songs to the magistrates, and let them compare them with our own, and if they are the same or better, we will give you a chorus. But if not, then, my friends, we cannot. Let these, then, be the customs ordained by law about all dances and the teaching of them, and let matters relating to slaves be separated from those relating to masters, if you do not object.
We can have no hesitation in assenting when you put the matter thus.
There still remain 3 studies suitable for freemen. Arithmetic is one of them. The measurement of length, surface, and depth is the second, and the third has to do with the revolutions of the stars in relation to one another. Not every one has need to toil through all these things in a strictly scientific manner, but only a few, and who they are to be we will hereafter indicate at the end, which will be the proper place. Not to know what is necessary for mankind in general, and what is the truth, is disgraceful to everyone, and yet to enter into these matters minutely is neither easy nor at all possible for everyone. But there is something in them which is necessary and cannot be set aside, and probably he who made the proverb about God originally had this in view when he said that not even God himself can fight against necessity. He meant, if I am not mistaken, divine necessity, for as to the human necessities of which the many speak, when they talk in this manner, nothing can be more ridiculous than such an application of the words.
And what necessities of knowledge are there, stranger, which are divine and not human?
I conceive them to be those of which he who has no use nor any knowledge at all cannot be a god, or demi-god, or hero to mankind, or able to take any serious thought or charge of them. And very unlike a divine man would he be, who is unable to count 1, 2, 3, or to distinguish odd and even numbers, or is unable to count at all, or reckon night and day, and who is totally unacquainted with the revolution of the sun and moon, and the other stars. There would be great folly in supposing that all these are not necessary parts of knowledge to him who intends to know anything about the highest kinds of knowledge, but which these are, and how many there are of them, and when they are to be learned, and what is to be learned together, and what apart, and the whole correlation of them, must be rightly apprehended first, and these leading the way, we may proceed to the other parts of knowledge. For so necessity grounded in nature constrains us, against which we say that no God contends, or ever will contend.
I think, stranger, that what you have now said is very true and agreeable to nature.
Yes, Cleinias, that is so, but it is difficult for the legislator to begin with these studies. At a more convenient time we will make regulations for them.
You seem, stranger, to be afraid of our habitual ignorance of the subject. There is no reason why that should prevent you from speaking out.
I certainly am afraid of the difficulties to which you allude, but I am still more afraid of those who apply themselves to this sort of knowledge, and apply themselves badly. For entire ignorance is not so terrible or extreme an evil, and is far from being the greatest of all. Too much cleverness and too much learning, accompanied with an ill bringing up, are far more fatal.
True.
All freemen, I conceive, should learn as much of these branches of knowledge as every child in Egypt is taught when he learns the alphabet. In that country, arithmetical games have been invented for the use of mere children, which they learn as a pleasure and amusement. They have to distribute apples and garlands, using the same number sometimes for a larger and sometimes for a lesser number of persons. And they arrange pugilists and wrestlers, as they pair together by lot or remain over, and show how their turns come in natural order. Another mode of amusing them is to distribute vessels, sometimes of gold, brass, silver, and the like, intermixed with one another, sometimes of one metal only. As I was saying, they adapt to their amusement the numbers in common use, and in this way make more intelligible to their pupils the arrangements and movements of armies and expedition, and in the management of a household they make people more useful to themselves and more wide awake, and again in measurements of things which have length and breadth and depth they free us from that natural ignorance of all these things which is so ludicrous and disgraceful.
What kind of ignorance do you mean?
Oh, my dear Cleinias, I, like yourself, have late in life heard with amazement of our ignorance in these matters. To me we appear to be more like pigs than men, not only of myself, but of all Hellenes.
About what? Say, stranger, what you mean.
I will, or rather I will show you my meaning by a question, and do you please to answer me. You know, I suppose, what length is.
Certainly.
And what breadth is.
To be sure.
And you know that these are two distinct things, and that there is a third thing called depth.
Of course.
And do not all these seem to you to be commensurable with themselves?
Yes.
That is to say, length is naturally commensurable with length, and breadth with breadth, and depth in like manner with depth.
Undoubtedly.
But if some things are commensurable, and others wholly incommensurable, and you think that all things are commensurable, what is your position in regard to them?
Clearly far from good.
Concerning length and breadth when compared with depth, or breadth and length when compared with one another, are not all the Hellenes agreed that these are commensurable with one another in some way?
Quite true.
But if they are absolutely incommensurable, and yet all of us regard them as commensurable, have we not reason to be ashamed of our compatriots? And might we not say to them, O ye best of Hellenes, is not this one of the things of which we were saying that not to know them is disgraceful, and of which to have a bare knowledge only is no great distinction?
Certainly.
And there are other things akin to these, in which there spring up other errors of the same family.
What are they?
The natures of commensurable and incommensurable quantities in their relation to one another. A man who is good for anything ought to be able, when he thinks, to distinguish them, and different persons should compete with one another in asking questions, which will be a far better and more graceful way of passing their time than the old man's game of draughts.
I dare say, and these pastimes are not so very unlike a game of draught.
And these, as I maintain, Cleinias, are the studies which our youth ought to learn, for they are innocent and not difficult. The learning of them will be an amusement, and they will benefit the state. If anyone is of another mind, let him say what he has to say.
Certainly.
Then if these studies are such as we maintain, we will include them. If not, they shall be excluded.
Assuredly. But may we not now, stranger, prescribe these studies as necessary, and so fill up the lacunae of our laws?
They shall be regarded as pledges which may be hereafter redeemed, and removed from our state, if they do not please either us who give them, or you who accept them.
A fair condition.
Next, let us see whether we are or are not willing that the study of astronomy shall be proposed for our youth.
Proceed.
Here occurs a strange phenomenon, which certainly cannot in any point of view be tolerated.
To what are you referring?
Men say that we ought not to inquire into the supreme God and the nature of the universe, nor busy ourselves in searching out the causes of things, and that such inquiries are impious, whereas the very opposite is the truth.
What do you mean?
Perhaps what I am saying may seem paradoxical, and at variance with the usual language of age. But when anyone has any good and true notion which is for the advantage of the state, and in every way acceptable to God, he cannot abstain from expressing it.
Your words are reasonable enough, but shall we find any good or true notion about the stars?
My good friends, at this hour, all of us Hellenes tell lies, if I may use such an expression, about those great gods, the sun and the moon.
Lies of what nature?
We say that they and divers other stars do not keep the same path, and we call them planets, or wanderers.
Very true, stranger, and in the course of my life I have often myself seen the morning star, and the evening star, and divers others not moving in their accustomed course, but wandering out of their path in all manner of ways, and I have seen the sun and moon doing what we all know that they do.
Just so, Megillus and Cleinias, and I maintain that our citizens and our youth ought to learn about the nature of the gods in heaven, so far as to be able to offer sacrifices and pray to them in pious language, and not to blaspheme about them.
There you are right. If such a knowledge be only attainable, and if we are wrong in our mode of speaking now, and can be better instructed, and learn to use better language, then I quite agree with you that such a degree of knowledge as will enable us to speak rightly should be acquired by us. And now do you try to explain to us your whole meaning, and we, on our part, will endeavor to understand you.
There is some difficulty in understanding my meaning, but not a very great one, nor will any great length of time be required. And of this I am myself a proof, for I did not know these things long ago, nor in the days of my youth, and yet I can explain them to you in a brief space of time, whereas if they had been difficult, I could certainly never have explained them all, old as I am, to old men like yourselves.
True, but what is this study which you describe as wonderful and fitting for youth to learn, but of which we are ignorant? Try and explain the nature of it to us as clearly as you can.
I will. For, O my good friends, that other doctrine about the wandering of the sun and the moon and the other stars is not the truth, but the very reverse of the truth. Each of them moves in the same path, not in many paths, but in one only, which is circular, and the varieties are only apparent. Nor are we right in supposing that the swiftest of them is the slowest, nor conversely, that the slowest is the quickest. And if what I say is true, only just imagine that we had a similar notion about horses running at Olympia, or about men who ran in the long course, and that we addressed the swiftest as the slowest and the slowest as the swiftest, and sang the praises of the vanquished, as though he were the victor. In that case, our praises would not be true, nor very agreeable to the runners, though they be but men. And now, to commit the same error about the gods, which would have been ludicrous and erroneous in the case of men, is not that ludicrous and erroneous?
Worse than ludicrous, I should say.
At all events, the gods cannot like us to be spreading a false report of them.
Most true, if such is the fact.
And if we can show that such is really the fact, then all these matters ought to be learned so far as is necessary for the avoidance of impiety. But if we cannot, they may be let alone, and let this be our decision.
Very good.
Enough of laws relating to education and learning. But hunting and similar pursuits in like manner claim our attention. For the legislator appears to have a duty imposed upon him which goes beyond mere legislation. There is something over and above law which lies in a region between admonition and law, and has several times occurred to us in the course of discussion. For example, in the education of very young children, there were things, as we maintain, which are not to be defined, and to regard them as matters of positive law is a great absurdity. Now, our laws and the whole constitution of our state having been thus delineated, the praise of the virtuous citizen is not complete when he is described as the person who serves the laws best and obeys them most, but the higher form of praise is that which describes him as the good citizen who passes through life undefiled and is obedient to the words of the legislator, both when he is giving laws and when he assigns praise and blame. This is the truest word that can be spoken in praise of a citizen, and a true legislator ought not only to write his laws, but also to interweave with them all such things as seem to him honorable and dishonorable. And the perfect citizen ought to seek to strengthen these, no less than the principles of law which are sanctioned by punishment. I will adduce an example which will clear up my meaning, and will be a sort of witness to my words. Hunting is of wide extent, and has a name under which many things are included, for there is a hunting of creatures in the water, and of creatures in the air, and there is a great deal of hunting of land animals of all kinds, and not of wild beasts only. The hunting after man is also worthy of consideration. There is the hunting after him in war, and there is often a hunting after him in the way of friendship, which is praised and also blamed. And there is thieving, and the hunting which is practiced by robbers, and that of armies against armies. Now the legislator, in laying down laws about hunting, can neither abstain from noting these things, nor can he make threatening ordinances which will assign rules and penalties about all of them. What is he to do? He will have to praise and blame hunting with a view to the exercise and pursuits of youth. And, on the other hand, the young man must listen obediently. Neither pleasure nor pain should hinder him, and he should regard as his standard of action the praises and injunctions of the legislator, rather than the punishments which he imposes by law. This being premised, there will follow next in order moderate praise and censure of hunting, the praise being assigned to that kind which will make the souls of young men better, and the censure to that which has the opposite effect. And now let us address young men in the form of a prayer for their welfare. O friends, we will say to them, may no desire or love of hunting in the sea, or of angling, or of catching the creatures in the waters, ever take possession of you, either when you are awake or when you are asleep, by hook or with wheels, which latter is a very lazy contrivance, and let not any desire of catching men and of piracy by sea enter into your souls, and make you cruel and lawless hunters. And as to the desire of thieving in town or country, may it never enter into your most passing thoughts, nor let the insidious fancy of catching birds, which is hardly worthy of freemen, come into the head of any youth. There remains, therefore, for our athletes only the hunting and catching of land animals, of which the one sort is called hunting by night, in which the hunters sleep in turn and are lazy. This is not to be commended any more than that which has intervals of rest, in which the wild strength of beasts is subdued by nets and snares, and not by the victory of a laborious spirit. Thus, only the best kind of hunting is allowed at all, that of quadrupeds, which is carried on with horses and dogs and men's own persons, and they get the victory over the animals by running them down and striking them and hurling at them, those who have a care of godlike manhood taking them with their own hands. The praise and blame which is assigned to all these things has now been declared, and let the law be as follows. Let no one hinder these who verily are sacred hunters from following the chase wherever and whithersoever they will, but the hunter by night, who trusts to his nets and gins, shall not be allowed to hunt anywhere. The fowler in the mountains and waste places shall be permitted, but on cultivated ground and on consecrated wilds he shall not be permitted, and anyone who meets him may stop him. As to the hunter in waters, he may hunt anywhere except in harbors or sacred streams or marshes, or pools, provided only that he do not pollute the water with poisonous juices. And now we may say that all our enactments about education are complete.
Very good.